Sometimes the greatest storms aren't the ones that rage outside our windows, but the ones that find us when we've given up on shelter altogether. The lighthouse keeper's cottage on Seal Point, Maine had stood empty for 2 years before Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived with nothing but grief and a desperate need to disappear. October's nor'easter was supposed to last 3 days. Instead, it became something the weather service couldn't explain, a supernatural tempest that seemed to feed on the darkness itself. On the first night, when lightning split the sky like broken glass, Elena found him collapsed against her door, a stranger with alabaster skin, clothes from another century, and wounds that should have killed him hours ago. She was a doctor who'd lost faith in healing after watching her 8-year-old daughter slip away despite every medical miracle at her disposal. He claimed to be something impossible, a creature of the night seeking refuge from hunters even more merciless than the storm. But as the days stretched into weeks and the storm refused to break, Elena began having dreams that felt like memories, speaking words in languages she'd never learned and recognizing places she'd never been. Was this mysterious man her salvation or her damnation? And why did touching his hand feel like coming home to a life she'd somehow forgotten? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled like something wounded and vengeful as Elena pressed her palm against the cottage's front door, steadying herself against the vibration of each gust that threatened to tear the old structure apart. 3 hours had passed since she'd dragged the unconscious stranger inside, and her hands still trembled, not from the cold, but from what she'd seen when she'd cut away his bloodied shirt. The wounds had been deep, claw marks, she'd thought initially, though what animal could have left gouges so precise, so deliberately cruel? But as she'd worked by lamplight, the power had failed within minutes of the storm's arrival. She'd watched the torn flesh begin to knit itself together with an efficiency that defied everything she knew about human physiology. Now he lay on her grandmother's faded floral couch, his breathing so shallow she had to lean close to confirm he was alive. In the flickering candlelight, his skin held an almost translucent quality, as if he were carved from moon-pale marble. Dark hair fell across a face that belonged in a Renaissance painting, all sharp cheekbones and classical lines that spoke of aristocracy from an age when such things mattered. Elena pulled her grandmother's wool shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved to the window, overlooking the rocky coastline. The lighthouse beam had died with the power, leaving only darkness beyond the glass. She'd come here to escape, from the hospital where she'd worked herself into exhaustion, from the empty rooms of her Portland house where Sophia's laughter still echoed in the silence, from the well-meaning friends who insisted 3 years was long enough to grieve. Her grandmother's cottage had always been her sanctuary. As a child, she'd spent summers here, learning to identify the calls of different seabirds and helping tend the small herb garden that somehow thrived despite the salt air. After Abuela died, Elena had kept the property but never found the courage to return, until last week, when the weight of another failed resuscitation had finally broken something inside her that she wasn't sure could be repaired. She'd planned to stay through Halloween, maybe longer if the solitude helped. She hadn't planned on a storm that the weather service was calling unprecedented and potentially historic. She certainly hadn't planned on a man who bled like any mortal but healed like something out of the fairy tales Abuela used to whisper during thunderstorms. A soft groan drew her attention back to the couch. The stranger's eyes were open, not brown or blue as she'd expected, but an unsettling shade of grey that seemed to catch and hold the candlelight. When his gaze found hers, Elena felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with medical concern. "You brought me inside," he said, his voice carrying a faint accent she couldn't place. Not quite European, but cultured in a way that suggested education from another era. "You were bleeding to death on my doorstep." Elena kept her distance, suddenly aware of how isolated they were, how completely the storm had cut them off from any help. "What happened to you?" He sat up slowly, testing his movements as if surprised by his own mobility. The wounds she'd seen earlier were now nothing more than thin silver lines across his chest. I was pursued. Those who hunted me were more persistent than I anticipated. Hunted? Elena's mind raced through possibilities. Drug runners, fugitives, domestic violence cases she'd seen too many times in the ER. Do I need to call the police? Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. I suspect your telephone is no longer functional. This storm has a way of isolating things. She checked her phone automatically, though she'd tried it dozens of times since the power failed. No signal, just as he'd predicted. How did you know that? Experience. He stood with fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone who'd been unconscious moments ago. I am Mikhail, and you are the doctor who saved my life, though I suspect you question whether it was worth saving. The observation hit too close to home. Elena backed toward the kitchen, where she'd left her grandmother's butcher knife within easy reach. I don't know what you mean. You carry grief like a wound that won't heal, Mikhail said quietly. I recognize it because I've worn it myself for longer than you might imagine. Lightning illuminated the cottage in stark white relief, and for one impossible moment, Elena could have sworn she saw something else in Mikhail's reflection in the window, or rather, the absence of something. But the moment passed, leaving only the steady drum of rain against glass and the growing certainty that this storm, this man, this night would change everything she thought she knew about the world. Outside, the wind rose to a shriek that sounded almost like laughter, as if something ancient and terrible was just beginning to wake. The candlelight wavered as another gust shook the cottage, and Elena found herself studying Mikhail's face in the dancing shadows. The absence she'd glimpsed in the window reflection gnawed at her, but exhaustion was beginning to cloud her judgment. Perhaps it had been a trick of the stormlight, nothing more than her overtired mind playing games. You should rest, she said, though she made no move away from the kitchen doorway. Your body's been through trauma, even if... She gestured vaguely at his chest, where the wounds had impossibly healed. Even if the evidence suggests otherwise. Mikhail's mouth curved in what might have been a smile, but it held no warmth. You are questioning everything you know about medicine, about what is possible. I can see it in your eyes. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how thin her flannel pajamas were, how vulnerable she felt in this space that had once been her greatest refuge. I've been working emergency medicine for 15 years. I've seen a lot of things that don't make immediate sense. Usually there's a logical explanation. And when there isn't? The question hung between them like a challenge. Elena thought of Sophia's final weeks, when she'd bargained with God and the universe for just one more day, one more hour. Logic had failed her then too. I should check your vitals, she said instead, deflecting. Make sure you're stable. I am more stable than I have been in months. Mikhail moved to the window, peering out at the storm with an expression of grim satisfaction. This weather will keep us safe for now. Safe from what? Who was hunting you? But he didn't answer, his attention fixed on something beyond the glass that she couldn't see. Elena found herself cataloguing details about him that her medical training had taught her to notice, the way he moved without favoring any part of his body despite his recent injuries, how his breathing seemed almost unnecessary rather than simply quiet, the unnatural stillness he possessed when he thought she wasn't watching. She thought of her normal life, the one waiting for her back in Portland, the hospital shifts that bled into each other, the apartment where she'd moved after selling the house she'd shared with Sophia and Marcus. Her ex-husband had remarried last spring. She'd heard through mutual friends and was expecting a baby. The news had hit her like a physical blow, not from jealousy, but from the cruel reminder of everything she'd lost. Dr. Patricia Chen, the hospital's chief of staff, had been pushing her to take the promotion to department head. More responsibility, more lives in her hands, more opportunities to fail the way she'd failed her own daughter. Elena had been avoiding the decision for months, just as she'd been avoiding her sister Carmen's increasingly worried phone calls and her mother's not-so-subtle hints about therapy and moving forward. Here, in the cottage, surrounded by Abuela's things, she'd finally felt like she could breathe again. The herb garden had been overgrown but salvageable. She'd spent her first few days pulling weeds and replanting, letting her hands remember the simple pleasure of coaxing life from soil. The work had been peaceful, in a way her hospital shifts never were. No codes to run, no families to comfort, no children slipping away despite everything she could do. "You came here to hide," Mikhail said suddenly, turning from the window. The observation was matter-of-fact, not accusatory, but it made her stiffen. "I came here to think." "About what?" Elena moved to the kitchen, needing something to do with her hands. She began brewing tea from the chamomile she'd dried weeks ago, before her world had narrowed to this cottage and this impossible storm. "My grandmother used to say that some questions can only be answered in quiet places." "And what questions are you asking?" She poured hot water over the herbs, watching them steep in the amber liquid. The familiar rituals steadied her, connected her to all the times Abuela had made this same tea during Elena's childhood visits. Whether I still know how to save anyone. Whether I ever did. The admission surprised her. She hadn't spoken those words aloud, had barely allowed herself to think them. But something about this night, this strange man, made honesty feel safer than the careful walls she'd built. "I lost my daughter 3 years ago," she continued, not looking at him. "Leukemia. I'm a doctor, and I couldn't save my own child." Mikhail was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed older than his apparent years. "Loss changes us in ways we don't expect. Sometimes it takes centuries to understand how." Centuries. An odd choice of words, but Elena was too tired to analyze it. She offered him a cup of tea, noting how his fingers felt cold against hers when he accepted it, and how careful he was not to let their skin touch for more than an instant. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, and Elena wondered if morning would bring clarity or only deeper mysteries. The storm's intensity doubled just as dawn should have arrived. Elena woke on the kitchen floor, her neck cramped from sleeping against the cabinet where she'd finally collapsed sometime after midnight. Grey light filtered through the windows, not the warm gold of sunrise, but the sickly pallor of a day that couldn't quite begin. Mikhail stood at the living room window, motionless as a statue. He wore the same position he'd held when exhaustion had finally claimed her, and Elena wondered with a chill if he'd moved at all during the night. The teacup sat untouched on the windowsill beside him, the chamomile cold and forgotten. "The storm should be weakening by now," Elena said, pulling herself upright. Every weather report she'd checked before the power failed had predicted the nor'easter would blow through by morning. Instead, the wind seemed angrier, more purposeful, as if it had found something worth staying for. "Should be," Mikhail agreed without turning around. "But this storm follows different rules than those your meteorologists understand." Elena joined him at the window, and her breath caught. The landscape had transformed overnight into something alien. Snow now mixed with the rain in spiraling patterns that defied physics, rising as often as falling. The ocean beyond the rocks moved with an oily, unnatural rhythm, and the sky held a greenish tint she'd never seen before in 30 years of Maine storms. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Many things are possible that your science hasn't yet acknowledged." Mikhail's reflection was fainter than it should have been in the glass, she realized, barely visible against the supernatural twilight outside. "The question is whether you're prepared to expand your understanding of the world." A new sound joined the wind's howl, something that might have been voices calling across the storm, though no words were distinguishable. Elena pressed her palm against the window, feeling vibrations that seemed to come from the earth itself rather than the air above. "What's happening out there?" "They've found me," Mikhail said quietly. "Sooner than I hoped, but the storm will hold them for now. We have perhaps a day, maybe 2. "Who are they?" Elena turned to face him, noting how the strange light made his already pale skin seem almost luminous. "What aren't you telling me?" Mikhail was silent for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't fathom. When he spoke, his words carried the careful precision of someone revealing a truth that could shatter everything. "I am not entirely human, Elena. Neither are those who hunt me." The admission should have sent her running, should have had her reaching for her phone, her keys, some way to escape this madness. Instead, Elena found herself thinking of Sophia's last night, when her daughter had suddenly sat up in the hospital bed and pointed to an empty corner of the room. "There's a lady there, Mama," Sophia had whispered. "She says it doesn't hurt where she is." Elena had seen nothing, but the monitors had shown Sophia's distress levels dropping for the first time in weeks. Her daughter had died peacefully an hour later, still gazing at that empty corner with wonder instead of fear. "Show me," Elena said now, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Mikhail turned to study her face, those strange grey eyes seeming to look deeper than her surface thoughts. "You've seen things already, haven't you? Things that made you question the boundaries of what you believed possible." Elena nodded slowly. The healing wounds, the missing reflection, the way he moved like gravity had less hold on him than it should, and deeper than that, older memories. Moments in the ER when she'd known a patient wouldn't survive seconds before their vitals crashed, dreams that felt more like memories of places she'd never been. "If I show you the truth," Mikhail said, "there will be no returning to your old understanding of the world. You'll be part of something larger and more dangerous than you can imagine." Through the window, those distant voices grew closer, and Elena caught fragments that sounded like her name carried on wind that shouldn't exist. The cottage creaked around them, but the sound was different now, less like wood straining against weather and more like something ancient awakening. Elena thought of her life waiting back in Portland, the promotion she didn't want, the empty apartment where she counted hours until she could lose herself in work again, the careful distance she maintained from anything that might matter enough to hurt her. "I've been half alive for 3 years, she said finally. "If you're offering me a choice between that and the truth, whatever it costs." She met his eyes steadily. "I choose the truth." Mikhail smiled then, the first genuine expression she'd seen cross his features, and Elena glimpsed something that might have been relief mixed with an emotion deeper than gratitude. "Then we begin," he said, as the storm outside shifted into something that sounded almost like anticipation. "But know this, once you step into my world, Elena, there may be no way back to the woman you were." The words hung in the air between them like a door left ajar, waiting for her to step through. Elena stared at Mikhail, her heart hammering against her ribs as the weight of what she'd just agreed to settled over her. The truth, she'd asked for it, demanded it even, but now that the moment had arrived, terror crept up her spine like ice water. "Wait," she breathed, backing away from the window. I need a moment." Mikhail's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those grey eyes that might have been understanding. He remained perfectly still as Elena paced to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she gripped the counter edge. What was she doing? 3 days ago, her biggest concern had been whether to accept Patricia's promotion. Now she was standing in her grandmother's cottage with a man who claimed to be inhuman, asking him to reveal truths that would, his words, change everything she understood about the world. The rational part of her mind, the part trained in evidence and logic, screamed warnings. She knew nothing about this stranger, except that he'd appeared during an impossible storm with wounds that healed too fast. He could be delusional, dangerous, or simply lying. The smart thing would be to wait out the storm, get him medical help, and return to her normal life, where the biggest mysteries were lab results and insurance codes. But what if he wasn't lying? Elena pressed her palms against her eyes, remembering Sophia's final weeks when desperation had made her research every alternative treatment, every case study that offered even false hope. She discovered things that medical school had never covered: spontaneous remissions with no scientific explanation, healers whose methods defied conventional understanding, patients who survived despite terminal diagnoses through means doctors couldn't replicate. She'd dismissed most of it as wishful thinking, statistical anomalies, or cases where crucial information was missing. But a small part of her had wondered what other possibilities existed beyond the boundaries of what she'd been taught. Elena. Mikhail's voice was gentle, but it made her jump anyway. He'd moved to the kitchen doorway, though she hadn't heard his footsteps. Your fear is understandable. Is it? She laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. Because I feel like I'm losing my mind. Yesterday, my biggest problem was deciding whether to become department head. Now I'm seriously considering that my house guest might be some kind of supernatural creature, and instead of running, She gestured helplessly. What's wrong with me? Nothing is wrong with you. You're simply at a crossroads that few humans ever face. Mikhail kept his distance, as if sensing her need for space. The choice to see beyond the veil of ordinary reality. And what if I don't want that choice? The question burst out of her before she could stop it. What if I want to go back to my safe, predictable life, where dead means dead and science has explanations for everything? Do you? He asked quietly. Elena opened her mouth to say yes, then closed it again. Because the truth was more complicated than that, wasn't it? Her safe, predictable life had been slowly suffocating her. Every shift at the hospital felt like swimming through concrete. Every morning in her empty apartment was a reminder of everything she'd lost and couldn't save. She thought of Sophia again, not the painful memories of hospitals and treatments, but earlier ones. Her daughter at age 5, insisting she could see angels in the corner of their garden. Sophia at 8, somehow knowing when their elderly neighbor Mrs. Patterson was going to die 3 days before it happened. Elena had dismissed it all as childhood imagination, but what if she'd been wrong? My daughter used to say things, Elena whispered, about seeing people who weren't there, knowing things she shouldn't have known. I thought it was just, children see patterns differently than adults, make connections we miss. She met Mikhail's gaze, but what if she was seeing something real? Children often perceive more clearly than adults, Mikhail said. We learn to ignore what doesn't fit our understanding of how the world should work. Outside, the storm's voice shifted again, and Elena heard something new in its howling, something that sounded almost like her name carried on wind that defied physics. The cottage walls groaned around them, but the sound felt less like structural stress and more like something ancient stirring to life. If I do this, Elena said slowly, if I let you show me whatever truth you're hiding, what happens to my life, my job, my family, everything I've built? I don't know, Mikhail admitted. Truth has its own momentum. Once released, it reshapes everything it touches. Elena thought of the promotion waiting for her, of Carmen's worried phone calls, of the carefully constructed distance she'd built between herself and anything that could hurt her again. She'd spent 3 years creating a life where nothing mattered enough to devastate her, where she could function without truly living. But standing here in her grandmother's cottage, with an impossible storm raging outside and a mysterious stranger offering to shatter her understanding of reality, Elena realized something that terrified her more than any supernatural revelation could. She was tired of being afraid. The question was whether she was brave enough to stop. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 3 years of careful numbness settling on her shoulders. Like a familiar coat she was finally ready to shed. Outside, the storm called her name again, a sound that should have been impossible, but somehow felt like coming home. Show me, she said, the words falling into the space between them with quiet finality. Whatever you are, whatever's hunting you, whatever this storm really is, I need to know. Mikhail studied her face for a long moment, as if memorizing it. Are you certain? Once I show you, Elena, there will be no pretending you didn't see, no returning to the comfortable illusion that the world is only what your medical textbooks described. I'm certain. And she was, with a clarity that surprised her. The fear was still there, coiling in her stomach like a living thing, but underneath it was something she hadn't felt since Sophia's diagnosis. Curiosity stronger than terror. The desire to understand, to know, to step beyond the safe boundaries she'd constructed around her wounded heart. Mikhail nodded slowly. Then we begin with the simplest truth. He moved to the center of the living room, where the strange grey light from the windows fell across his pale features. Watch carefully. He closed his eyes, and Elena felt the air in the cottage shift, not moving but somehow becoming denser, charged with potential like the moment before lightning strikes. When he opened his eyes again, they weren't grey anymore. They were silver, metallic and luminous, reflecting light that shouldn't exist. Elena's breath caught, but she didn't step back. Medical training kicked in automatically, cataloguing what she observed: pupil dilation inconsistent with lighting conditions, sclera showing no signs of irritation that would accompany contact lenses, iris color change beyond the scope of known human physiology. "How?" she whispered. "This is what I am," Mikhail said, his voice carrying new harmonics that seemed to resonate in her bones. "What your folklore calls vampire, though the reality is more complex than your stories suggest." The word should have sent her running. Instead, Elena found herself stepping closer, physician's instincts overriding fear. "You're dead?" "Not dead. Changed. Made into something that exists between life and death, sustained by blood but not truly alive in the way you understand it." His smile was sad, ancient. "I have walked this earth for 7 centuries, Elena. I have watched empires fall, plagues sweep across continents, the birth of your modern world. 7 centuries. Elena's mind struggled to process the scope of it, the loneliness, the endless accumulation of loss. "That's why your wounds healed so fast, why I can barely see your reflection. Among other things, yes." Mikhail's eyes began to fade back to their normal grey, but the air around him still hummed with otherness. "I am faster than humans, stronger, more resilient. I do not age, and I require blood to survive, though I have not taken an unwilling life in over 300 years. Elena absorbed this, her scientific mind already forming questions even as a deeper part of her. The part that had always known the world contained more mysteries than medicine could explain, accepted it with startling ease. "The people hunting you, are they—" "Older than I am, more powerful, and far less concerned with human life." Mikhail's expression darkened. "I took something from them, something they believed was theirs by right. They have pursued me across half the world to reclaim it. What did you take?" But before he could answer, the storm outside exploded into violence that made their previous nights seem gentle. The cottage windows rattled in their frames, and Elena heard something new in the wind's howl, voices, definitely voices, speaking words in a language that sounded like breaking glass and winter storms. "They're testing the barriers," Mikhail said urgently, moving to the window with inhuman speed. "The storm is powerful, but it won't hold them indefinitely." Elena joined him, peering out into the supernatural twilight. Dark shapes moved through the spiraling snow and rain, not quite human, flowing across the landscape with predatory grace. Even at this distance, she could feel their hunger, their rage, pressing against the cottage walls like a physical force. "What kind of barriers?" she asked, surprised by her own calm. "Your grandmother's protections." She was more than she seemed, Elena. "This cottage sits on ground that has been sacred for centuries, warded by blood and intention and old promises. But my presence here weakens those protections. Eventually they will find a way through." Elena stared at him, pieces clicking into place with frightening clarity. "That's why you came here specifically. You knew about Abuela's protections." "I knew she was a guardian of old knowledge, yes. I hoped her wards would shelter me long enough to—" He stopped, studying her face. "You feel it, don't you? The recognition. As if you've heard this story before." She did feel it, a strange déjà vu that made her skin prickle. Standing here beside him, watching inhuman predators stalk through an impossible storm, felt familiar in a way that should have been terrifying but instead felt like remembering. "What's happening to me?" she whispered. Mikhail's hand moved as if to touch her face, then stopped just short of contact. "You're becoming who you were always meant to be." The words sent a chill through Elena that had nothing to do with the supernatural storm. "What does that mean?" Before Mikhail could answer, the cottage shuddered around them, not from wind but from something pressing against the walls themselves. The air grew thick, oppressive, and Elena felt a presence probing at the edges of her consciousness, like cold fingers searching for cracks. "They're here," Mikhail breathed, his silver eyes flaring bright in the strange light. "Stay close to me, and whatever happens, don't leave the circle of salt your grandmother laid around this room." Elena looked down, noticing for the first time the thin line of white crystals that formed a perfect ring around the living area. How had she missed something so obvious? Salt? Sea salt, blessed and charged with protective intent. Your grandmother was a wise woman. Mikhail moved to the center of the circle, gesturing for Elena to follow. She knew this day would come. The voices outside grew clearer now, speaking that same glass-breaking language. But underneath their alien words, Elena heard something that made her blood freeze. They were calling her name. Not just calling it, singing it, like a lullaby or a summoning. "How do they know who I am?" Panic crept into her voice, despite her efforts to stay calm. "Because you're not just Elena Vasquez, emergency physician from Portland." Mikhail's gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "You're the granddaughter of Maria Santos, keeper of the old ways. You're the daughter of Isabella Santos Vasquez, who fled this calling to live an ordinary life. And you're—" The front door exploded inward. Elena screamed as dark figures poured through the opening like smoke given form. They wore shapes that might have been human once, but stretched and twisted until they resembled living shadows, with too many teeth and eyes like dying stars. The salt circle blazed to life around Elena and Mikhail, white light erupting from the crystals to form a barrier the creatures couldn't cross. "The reincarnation of someone I lost long ago," Mikhail finished grimly, silver eyes blazing as he faced their attackers. One of the shadow things spoke, its voice like winter wind through dead leaves. The words were in that alien tongue, but somehow Elena understood them. "Give us what you stole, blood drinker, and we will make her death swift." "I will give you nothing," Mikhail replied in the same language, and Elena realized with shock that she understood his words too. "She is under my protection." The creature that might have been their leader laughed, a sound like breaking bones. "Your protection? You who fled across the ocean like a whipped dog? You are nothing compared to what we have become." Elena watched in frozen terror as the creatures began to circle their protective barrier, testing it, probing for weakness. Where they touched the salt line, sparks flew and the light grew brighter, but she could see the strain it was putting on the ancient protections. "What did you steal?" she whispered to Mikhail. He didn't take his eyes off their attackers. "Something that belonged to you first." Before she could ask what that meant, one of the creatures pressed closer to the barrier and spoke directly to her. When it did, its face shifted, becoming almost human, a woman with Elena's own dark hair and eyes, but pale as moonlight. "Hello, sister," it said in perfect English. "Do you remember me yet?" Elena's world tilted. The cottage, the storm, the circle of salt, everything faded except that familiar face wearing an expression of infinite sadness and rage. I don't understand." "Look deeper," the creature urged. "Look past this life, past the barriers your human mind has built. Remember who you were before you forgot yourself in flesh and blood and the small concerns of mortals." Images flashed through Elena's mind. A cliff overlooking the sea, but not this sea. Somewhere warmer, more ancient. A woman who looked like her but wasn't her, dressed in white robes, standing before an altar carved with symbols that hurt to perceive, the taste of copper and starlight. A choice between love and duty that had torn the world apart. No, Elena gasped, pressing her hands to her temples as memories that weren't hers flooded through her consciousness. This isn't real. I'm Elena Vasquez. I'm a doctor. I live in Portland and I lost my daughter and before that, the creature pressed. Before this life, before this body, before you chose to bind yourself to mortality for love of him. It gestured toward Mikhail with contempt. What were you then, sister? The salt circle flickered, responding to Elena's emotional turmoil. She felt Mikhail's hand on her shoulder steadying her, but also felt the weight of centuries pressing against her memories like a dam about to burst. Don't listen to her, Mikhail said urgently. Whatever you were, whoever you might have been, you're Elena now. You chose this life. You chose humanity. Did I? Elena whispered, staring at the creature who called her sister. Or was it chosen for me? The cottage shuddered again, and somewhere in the distance, Elena heard the sound of old promises beginning to break. The salt circle pulsed with unstable light as Elena's knees nearly buckled under the weight of foreign memories. Mikhail's grip on her shoulder tightened, anchoring her to the present even as centuries of buried existence clawed at her consciousness. Fight it, he whispered urgently. Whatever she's showing you, those memories aren't meant for mortal minds to hold. But Elena could barely hear him over the roar of recognition flooding her system. She saw herself, no, someone who had been herself, standing on marble steps beneath stars that formed different constellations. Her hands had been pale then, inhuman, crackling with power that could reshape reality with a thought. She had been something magnificent and terrible, a being of pure will who commanded storms and bent the fabric of existence to her desires. And she had given it all up. Why? Elena gasped, the question torn from her lips as the creature wearing her face smiled with infinite patience. Because you were weak, it replied, circling the protective barrier like a predator. Because you chose the fleeting warmth of mortal love over the eternal glory of what we were born to be. You diminished yourself, sister, made yourself small and fragile and temporary. Through the chaos in her mind, Elena felt Mikhail's tension radiating like heat. When she glanced at him, his expression held a guilt so profound it made her stomach clench. What aren't you telling me? She demanded. The creature laughed before Mikhail could respond. Shall I show her, blood drinker? Shall I reveal what you've hidden behind centuries of careful half-truths? The other shadow beings pressed closer to the circle's edge, and Elena realized they weren't just testing the barrier. They were feeding off the emotional turmoil within it. Each spike of her confusion and fear made them more solid, more real. Elena, Mikhail said, his voice strained with an anguish that seemed to encompass lifetimes. I never meant for this to happen. When I found you again, when I realized what you'd become, I thought I could protect you from the truth. What truth? But even as she asked, more images crashed through her consciousness, herself and Mikhail in some ancient place, locked in an embrace that blazed with otherworldly power. The feel of immortal flesh beneath her fingers, the taste of starlight and eternity on her lips, a love so vast it had literally moved mountains. And then the choice, the terrible, impossible choice. I was dying, Mikhail said quietly, never taking his eyes off their attackers. 7 centuries ago, I was mortal and dying of a plague that swept through my village. You found me, brought me to your sanctuary, and I begged you to save me. Elena's breath caught as the memory surfaced fully, Mikhail as he had been then, young and desperate and beautiful, pleading with her to grant him immortality. But the price, there was always a price. You turned him, Elena whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. But vampires aren't made by other vampires, are they? They're made by beings like what you used to be, the creature finished with satisfaction. Creatures of pure supernatural force who can reshape the fundamental nature of mortal flesh. But such transformations require a sacrifice, don't they, sister? A trade of power for love. Elena saw it all now. Herself as she had been, pouring her immortal essence into Mikhail's dying body, knowing it would bind her to mortality in return. She had chosen to become human, to age and die and be reborn again and again, all for the chance to love him as an equal, rather than as a goddess loves a pet. "You gave up everything for me," Elena said, staring at Mikhail with a mixture of wonder and horror, "and I can't even remember choosing it." "Each rebirth strips away more of your true nature," he replied, his voice breaking. "I've found you in 17 different lives, Elena. 17 times I've watched you die of old age or disease or accident, and each time you remember less of what you were." The protective circle flickered dangerously as Elena's emotional state shifted from confusion to a rage so pure it felt like swallowing lightning, not just at the cosmic injustice of it all, but at Mikhail himself. "You let me choose ignorance," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "This time, when you found me again, you could have told me the truth from the beginning. Instead, you let me think I was going crazy, let me question my own sanity." "I wanted you to have a choice," Mikhail said desperately. "Free of the weight of past lives, free of obligations to power you deliberately abandoned. I wanted you to choose me, choose us, as Elena, not as an echo of what you used to be." "How noble," the creature sneered. He wanted to keep his pet human ignorant and malleable. "But power calls to power, sister. You're already remembering. Soon you'll understand that this small life, this insignificant existence, is a prison he helped forge around your true nature." Elena felt the truth of it burning in her veins. Memories of command, of reshaping reality with pure will, of standing as equal to forces that predated human civilization. The cottage suddenly felt suffocating, her mortal body a cage barely containing something vast and hungry for freedom. The salt circle guttered like a dying flame as Elena took her first step toward reclaiming what she had been. The moment Elena's foot crossed the salt line, reality exploded. Power that had been dormant for centuries erupted through her mortal frame like molten gold through glass. The cottage walls buckled outward as forces older than human civilization poured from her transformed flesh, and the supernatural storm outside screamed in harmony with energies it recognized as kin. Elena's consciousness expanded beyond the confines of her skull, touching the vast web of existence she had once commanded as naturally as breathing. But her human body, Dr. Elena Vasquez's carefully mortal flesh, began to tear apart under the strain. "Elena, no!" Mikhail lunged toward her, his vampire speed useless against the barrier of raw power now surrounding her. Where the energy touched him, his skin blistered and smoked. "Your mortal form can't contain what you're trying to become." She could barely hear him over the roar of awakening divinity. Her hands, crackling with silver fire, reached toward the creature that had called her sister. Now that Elena's true sight was opening, she could see what the shadow thing really was. A fragment of herself, cast off when she had chosen mortality, left to fester in the spaces between worlds for 700 years. "Yes," the creature whispered, its borrowed face alight with terrible joy. "Remember what we were. Remember what he cost us." Elena's memories crashed through her in waves that threatened to drown her humanity entirely. She saw the pantheon she had belonged to, beings of pure supernatural force who had shaped the early world according to their whims. She remembered the taste of worship, the intoxication of commanding storms and seasons, the glorious isolation of existing beyond mortal concerns. And she remembered the choice that had damned them both. "I loved you," she gasped, her voice harmonizing with itself as divine and human natures warred within her throat. "I loved you enough to become less than I was." Love, her shadow self spat. A human weakness that infected our perfect nature. Look what it brought us. Centuries of degradation, death after meaningless death, while he remains unchanged and eternal. He has lost nothing while we have lost everything. The cottage groaned as Elena's expanding power tested the boundaries of physical space. Through the hurricane of memories and awakening divinity, she felt her mortal consciousness beginning to fragment. Elena Vasquez, the woman who had lost her daughter, who had chosen medicine as a way to fight death, who had found Mikhail bleeding on her doorstep, was being consumed by something too vast for human flesh to hold. But in that dissolution, she finally understood her greatest fear, not death, not the loss of love, but the loss of choice itself. As her divine nature reasserted control, she could feel her human compassion burning away like morning mist. The grief that had shaped Elena Vasquez, the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to save lives, the stubborn hope that had brought her to this lighthouse, all of it was being devoured by something that considered such emotions beneath its notice. "This is what you were afraid of," she whispered, silver fire pouring from her eyes as she looked at Mikhail. "Not that I would die again, but that I would remember and stop choosing to be human." Mikhail's face was a mask of anguish. "Elena, please, you don't have to choose between mortality and power. There has to be another way." "There is," the shadow creature said, its form becoming more solid as Elena's power fed it. "Embrace what we truly are. Reclaim our stolen divinity. Make him pay for the centuries he stole from us." Elena felt the seductive pull of that option. It would be so easy to let go of human weakness, to shed the pain of loss and the fear of death, to become again what she had been in the beginning. But as her mortal memories began to fade, one image blazed through the divine fire consuming her thoughts: Sophia, her 3-year-old daughter, dying of leukemia despite every tool of modern medicine. The child Elena had loved as a mortal, the grief that had defined her human existence, the very wound that had driven her to this lighthouse, to this moment, to this impossible choice. "I know what you stole from them," Elena said suddenly, her voice cutting through the storm of power like a blade. She turned to Mikhail, understanding blazing in her transformed features. "Not just their power, not just me. You stole my right to choose ignorance." The cottage exploded outward as Elena's dual nature reached its breaking point. Storm winds howled through the ruined walls as she stood at the center of a maelstrom of divine energy and human will, her body fracturing between what she had been and what she had chosen to become. Around them, more shadow creatures materialized, other fragments of discarded divinity drawn by the scent of power being born. Mikhail's silver eyes blazed as he prepared to fight beings that could unmake him with a thought. And Elena Vasquez, mortal physician and forgotten goddess, faced the choice that would determine not just her fate, but the nature of reality itself. The ordeal had truly begun. Elena's scream shattered the night as her mortal form began to collapse under the weight of divine power. What had felt like glorious awakening moments before now felt like drowning in molten starlight. Her human nervous system, built to process the mundane concerns of a physician's life, simply couldn't contain the vast consciousness of what she had once been. Blood streamed from her eyes, nose, and ears as her brain hemorrhaged under the pressure of 7 centuries' worth of memories flooding back simultaneously. She saw herself dying 17 different deaths: plague, accident, old age, violence, each rebirth stripping away more of her divine nature until only fragments remained, buried so deep in her mortal psyche that even she had forgotten their existence. "I can't," she gasped, falling to her knees among the ruined walls of her grandmother's cottage. "It's too much. I can't hold both." The shadow creature that wore her face laughed with bitter triumph. "Because you were never meant to be human, sister. Your mortal form is a cage, and cages break when their prisoners remember they have wings." Around them, more shadow beings solidified, drawn by Elena's failing attempt to reconcile 2 incompatible natures. They were all fragments of discarded divinity, pieces of gods and goddesses who had tried to diminish themselves for love, for curiosity, for the simple desire to understand mortality. Each one had failed, leaving behind these hungry echoes that fed on supernatural power and divine regret. Mikhail fought desperately to reach Elena through the chaos, his vampire strength useless against forces that predated physical law. Where the divine energy touched him, his flesh blackened and peeled away, revealing the terrible truth beneath his careful humanity. He was as much a prisoner of Elena's ancient choice as she was. "Elena, listen to me," he called out, his voice barely audible over the roar of colliding realities. "You don't have to choose between them. There's a third option." "Lies," her shadow self hissed, pressing closer to Elena's writhing form. "He speaks of choices while keeping you ignorant of your true nature. How many lifetimes has he watched you suffer and die saying nothing? How many times has he let you grieve for the daughter you lost, knowing you once had the power to reshape life and death itself?" The words hit Elena like physical blows. Sophia, her beautiful, brilliant Sophia, who had loved astronomy and wanted to be a doctor like her mother, had died despite every miracle of modern medicine because Elena Vasquez was only human. But the being she had once been could have reached into the fabric of existence itself and rewritten the laws that govern cellular division, could have made cancer impossible with a thought. "You let our daughter die," Elena whispered, staring at Mikhail with eyes that blazed with silver fire. 17 times you found me, and you never once thought to tell me I had the power to save the children I lost." Mikhail's face crumpled with anguish. "Because that power comes with a price you've already paid too many times. Every time you use it, you lose more of your humanity. I've watched you become something cold and terrible, Elena. I've seen what happens when you remember too much too quickly. Better terrible and powerful than human and helpless," the shadow creature crooned, its form growing more solid as Elena's rage fed it. "Reclaim what was stolen from you, sister. Make him pay for centuries of willful blindness." Elena felt her consciousness splitting along fault lines carved by impossible choices. The human part of her, Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had sworn an oath to do no harm, recoiled from the violence her shadow self hungered for, but the divine part remembered what it felt like to command the fundamental forces of existence, to be truly powerful instead of merely skilled. The lighthouse beam, automated and oblivious to the supernatural chaos, swept across the ruined cottage and illuminated the truth Elena had been running from. She was dying. Her mortal brain was shutting down under the neurological stress of containing memories that spanned millennia. Blood vessels burst behind her eyes as centuries of accumulated trauma crashed through neural pathways never designed to hold such weight. "Choose quickly, sister," the shadow being whispered urgently. "Embrace divinity and shed this dying flesh, or cling to mortality and let both aspects burn away to nothing." Elena looked around at the destruction her awakening power had caused. The cottage where her grandmother had taught to find peace was reduced to splinters and rubble. The storm that had seemed supernatural before now revealed itself as purely natural compared to the forces tearing through her transformed consciousness. Even Mikhail, ancient and powerful as he was, could only watch helplessly as she came apart at the seams. 17 lifetimes of choosing love over power, and this was where it had led, to a moment where any choice meant losing something precious and irreplaceable. As Elena Vasquez felt her human memories beginning to fragment and fade, she realized with crystal clarity that some prices were too high to pay, even for love, and some choices once made could never be unmade. The darkness at the edge of her vision wasn't unconsciousness approaching. It was oblivion, come to claim what remained of both the woman and the goddess she had tried to be. But as oblivion reached for her with hungry fingers, Elena Vasquez made the most human choice of all. She refused to surrender. "No," she gasped through blood-frothed lips, her voice barely a whisper against the roar of divine energy tearing her apart. "I won't choose between them. I won't let either part of me die." The shadow creature recoiled as if struck. "Impossible. You cannot be both. The mortal form cannot." "The mortal form is dying because it's fighting what I am instead of accepting it," Elena said, her physician's mind cutting through the chaos with surgical precision. Even as her divine memories threatened to overwhelm her human consciousness, She clung to the methodical thinking that had saved countless lives in trauma bays and emergency rooms. But I'm not just Elena Vasquez, and I'm not just whatever goddess I used to be. I'm something new. She pressed her palms against the broken earth, feeling the lighthouse's foundation beneath her fingers, the same lighthouse her grandmother had tended for 40 years, where 3 generations of mortal women had chosen love over fear, hope over despair. Her human memories might be fragmenting, but they weren't disappearing. They were integrating, weaving themselves into the vast tapestry of her divine nature like golden thread through ancient cloth. Elena, Mikhail breathed, understanding dawning in his silver eyes. You're not trying to contain the power. You're trying to evolve it. The revelation hit her like lightning. For 7 centuries, she had been approaching the problem backward, thinking she had to choose between divine and human, power and love, immortality and mortality. But what if the choice itself was the trap? What if there was a third path that no one had ever dared to walk? I remember now, she said, her voice growing stronger as scattered memories began to coalesce into something coherent. I remember all of it, every lifetime, every choice, every moment I decided that love was worth the risk of loss. She looked up at her shadow self, seeing it clearly for what it was, not a cast-off fragment of divinity, but the part of her that had never learned to be afraid. You're not my enemy. You're what I've been running from my entire human existence. The shadow creature's face twisted with confusion and rage. I am your power, your birthright, your... My refusal to grieve, Elena finished quietly. When I chose mortality the first time, I created you to hold everything I thought would make love impossible. The terrible beauty of being divine, the knowledge that I could reshape reality itself, the temptation to make every choice for the people I loved instead of letting them choose for themselves. She struggled to her feet, divine fire and mortal blood streaming down her face in equal measure. But grief isn't weakness, loss isn't failure, they're what make love meaningful. The storm above them began to shift, its supernatural fury transforming into something that felt almost like music. Elena could sense the change in ways her mortal form never could have perceived. Reality itself was listening, waiting to see what she would become. Mikhail, she said, turning to face the vampire who had loved her through 17 lifetimes of loss. You were wrong to hide the truth from me, but you were right about one thing. The power without the humanity becomes monstrous, but the humanity without the power, she gestured to the destruction around them, to the centuries of unnecessary death and loss, becomes tragedy. He stepped toward her, no longer flinching from the energy that surrounded her. Somehow, impossibly, it no longer burned him. What are you saying? I'm saying I choose both, Elena said. And as the words left her lips, she felt something fundamental shift in the fabric of existence. I choose to be a goddess who knows what it means to lose a child, a divine being who has cleaned infected wounds and held dying strangers and felt her own heart break 17 times over. I choose to be Elena Vasquez and everything I was before her, not in sequence but simultaneously. The shadow creature let out a wail of denial that shattered the remaining windows in the lighthouse, but Elena could feel its resistance weakening. As she opened her arms to embrace the fragment of herself she had tried to deny, power and compassion began to merge in ways that defied every law she had ever known about the separation between mortal and divine. This has never been done, her shadow self whispered, as it was drawn inexorably into Elena's waiting embrace. Then we'll be the first, Elena replied, and opened her heart to contain multitudes. The lighthouse beams swept across them one final time as Elena Vasquez, physician, mother, goddess, and something entirely new, took her first breath as a being who had chosen to transcend the very concept of choice itself. Everything, absolutely everything, had shifted. The silence that followed was profound, not the absence of sound, but the presence of perfect balance. Elena stood in the ruins of her grandmother's cottage, no longer fragmenting between competing natures. The divine fire that had threatened to consume her now flowed through her mortal form like blood through veins, transforming rather than destroying. She flexed her fingers experimentally, watching silver light dance beneath skin that remained stubbornly, beautifully human. The hemorrhaging had stopped. The neurological overload that had nearly killed her had resolved into something unprecedented. A mortal mind expanded to hold immortal consciousness without losing what made it fundamentally, recognizably, Elena Vasquez. "How do you feel?" Mikhail asked softly, approaching with the careful reverence one might show a newborn star. Elena considered the question seriously. The memories were all there, 7 centuries of lifetimes, millennia of divine existence before that, the vast sweep of cosmic history she had witnessed and shaped. But they no longer threatened to drown her humanity. Instead, they enriched it, giving weight and context to every choice she had made as Dr. Elena Vasquez. "Tired," she said, surprising herself with a laugh, "and hungry. Apparently transcending the laws of existence works up an appetite." The normalcy of her response seemed to break something loose in Mikhail's careful control. He moved toward her with desperate hope, stopping just short of touch. "Elena, are you still me?" She reached out to cup his face, marveling at how her enhanced senses could perceive the complexity of his existence. Vampire, but so much more than that. Ancient pain wrapped around fierce love, centuries of loneliness punctuated by brief, precious interludes of connection. "Yes. More me than I've ever been, actually." The storm overhead was dissipating. Its supernatural fury no longer needed to contain the chaos of Elena's transformation. Natural wind began to replace eldritch forces, and through the clearing clouds, the first stars in weeks became visible. Elena turned her attention to those stars and felt a shock of recognition. She could sense the vast network of power that connected all things, not just the supernatural forces she had once commanded as a goddess, but the quieter miracles she had witnessed as a physician, the precise choreography of cells dividing and healing, the elegant mathematics of immune systems and neural pathways, the stubborn persistence of hope in the face of impossible odds. "I can see it all," she whispered, wonder coloring her voice. The connections between everything, the patterns that govern both divine intervention and medical intervention. They're not separate systems. They're different expressions of the same fundamental truth. Mikhail's hand found hers, solid and warm. What truth? That love requires both the power to act and the wisdom to know when not to. Elena squeezed his fingers, grounding herself in the simple human gesture, even as cosmic awareness expanded around her. "I couldn't save Sofia as Elena Vasquez because I didn't have the power. But I couldn't save any of the children in my other lifetimes as a goddess because I had lost the understanding of why they were worth saving in the first place." The implications were staggering. For the first time in her existence, she possessed both the divine ability to reshape reality and the human emotional intelligence to wield that power responsibly. She could feel the places where the world was broken, where suffering persisted not because it was necessary but because no one with sufficient power had cared enough to fix it. But she could also feel the delicate balance that made free will possible, the beautiful fragility that gave meaning to every choice. Her divine nature wanted to reach out immediately and begin healing the world's wounds. Her human nature understood that some struggles were necessary, that growth required the freedom to fail as well as succeed. "This is what you were afraid of, isn't it?" she asked Mikhail. "Not that I would remember and become cold and terrible, but that I would remember and become something you couldn't predict or control." He nodded slowly. In every other lifetime, the choice was binary. Divine power meant losing your humanity. Human love meant accepting powerlessness. I hoped, that keeping you ignorant was protecting you from having to choose between them. Instead, you were protecting yourself from having to face what I might choose if I had all the information. Elena's voice held no judgment, only understanding. You were afraid I would decide that love wasn't worth the limitations you thought it required. The lighthouse beam swept across them again, but now Elena could perceive its light in spectrums beyond human vision. She could see the electromagnetic radiation, yes, but also the hope it represented, her grandmother's belief that even in the darkest storms, it was possible to be a beacon for others. Elena Vasquez, physician and goddess, mortal and divine, felt something she hadn't experienced since Sophia's death, unshakable hope tempered by hard-won wisdom. She had the power to change everything, and finally she understood how to use it without losing everything she had learned about what made change worthwhile. "We need to talk," she said to Mikhail, her voice carrying new harmonics of authority and compassion. "About what comes next, about what this means for both of us." She was no longer running from anything. The gathering of her strength was complete. Mikhail's silence stretched between them like a held breath. Elena could see the war playing out behind his silver eyes, centuries of protective instincts warring with the dawning realization that the woman he loved no longer needed his protection, perhaps had never needed it in the way he'd imagined. "You're afraid," Elena said gently, settling onto a piece of broken stone that had once been part of her grandmother's garden wall. The casual way she moved belied the cosmic forces now flowing through her veins. "After 700 years of thinking you knew how this story would end, you're afraid of what I might write instead." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture so achingly familiar it made her chest tighten with mortal emotion, even as divine awareness showed her the quantum mechanics of muscle memory and learned behavior. "I've spent lifetimes trying to save you from the choice between power and love. Now you've made a third choice I never imagined possible, and I don't know what that means for us." "It means," Elena said, rising and moving toward the lighthouse, "that for the first time, we get to find out what we are when we're both completely honest about what we are." She placed her palm against the lighthouse's weathered stone, feeling the decades of salt spray and storm winds that had shaped its surface. But beneath that, her enhanced senses detected something else, threads of supernatural energy woven into the very foundation. Her grandmother hadn't just been a lighthouse keeper. She had been a guardian, maintaining barriers that kept certain forces at bay. "Mikhail, what was my grandmother protecting this place from?" His footsteps crunched on broken glass as he approached. "The same thing I've been running from. The same thing that's been hunting fragments of divine power for millennia." He paused beside her, his supernatural senses clearly picking up the same energy signatures she was detecting. The Void Shepherds, they're what remains of the first gods, the ones who chose absolute power over everything else and consumed themselves in the process. Now they exist only to devour others like what you've become. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the main wind. In her recovered memories, she could see flashes of these beings, ancient beyond measure, hungering for the divine essence they had lost to their own greed. They were why she had chosen mortality in the first place, why she had hidden herself in human flesh life after life. "They know I've awakened," she said. Not a question, but a statement. The storm that had raged for weeks, trapping her and Mikhail together, hadn't been natural or even coincidental. It had been a hunting net, designed to contain her transformation until they could arrive to claim what she had become. Yes. The moment you integrated your divine and mortal aspects, you became visible to them again. Mikhail's voice carried the weight of centuries of dread. "That's why I never told you the truth. Every time you remembered your full nature, they found you. And every time, you had to choose between becoming like them to survive or dying as yourself." Elena turned to face him fully, silver fire dancing in her eyes. "But I'm not the same being they've hunted before. I'm not choosing between power and humanity. I'm wielding both simultaneously." She could feel her divine consciousness reaching out, testing the boundaries of her new existence. "They've never encountered anything like what I've become." "Which makes you either our salvation or our doom," Mikhail said quietly. "Elena, I need you to understand something. In my efforts to protect you, I've made choices that have consequences. Allies I've betrayed, bargains I've struck, promises I've broken. The Void Shepherds aren't the only ones who want what you are now." The confession hung between them like a blade. Elena felt the familiar surge of anger, another lifetime, another web of lies and half-truths designed to protect her from her own choices. But this time, the emotion was tempered by divine perspective. She could see the fear that had driven his decisions, the genuine love twisted into possessive control by the weight of watching her die again and again. "Tell me," she said simply, "all of it. No more protection, no more careful editing of the truth. If we're going to face what's coming, I need to know exactly what you've done." Mikhail's composure finally cracked. 7 centuries of careful control shattered, leaving behind raw vulnerability that was somehow more beautiful than any mask he'd worn. "I made a deal with the Council of Shadows, your location in exchange for safe passage through their territories. I hoped I could find another way before they came to collect." Elena felt the betrayal hit her like a physical blow, but underneath the hurt was something else, a strange relief. Finally, the complete truth. Finally, the real stakes instead of the sanitized version Mikhail thought she could handle. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what he'd revealed. 3 days, maybe less. Elena looked out at the sea, her enhanced vision picking up disturbances on the horizon that had nothing to do with weather patterns. Ancient powers stirring, drawn by the scent of transformed divinity. "Then we'd better get started," she said, and began to plan for a war that would determine not just their survival, but the future of power itself. The first sign came at dawn, a wrongness in the light itself that made Elena's newly integrated senses recoil. The sunrise bled crimson across the horizon, but beneath the natural spectrum lay something else. Shadows that moved independently of their sources, reaching toward shore with predatory intent. "They're early," Mikhail said, joining her on the lighthouse's observation deck. His centuries of experience showed in the way he moved, economical, purposeful, a warrior preparing for inevitable battle. Elena nodded, her divine awareness mapping the approaching threats with crystalline clarity. 3 distinct signatures, each older than recorded history, each radiating the hollow hunger of beings who had consumed their own essence in pursuit of absolute power. The Void Shepherds had found her scent and followed it like bloodhounds tracking wounded prey. But she wasn't wounded anymore. She wasn't fragmenting or hiding or choosing between competing aspects of herself. For the first time in 7 centuries, she was whole. "The Council of Shadows will arrive from the north within hours," Elena said, her enhanced perception reading the supernatural currents like a weather map. "They're moving fast, whatever. You promised them. They're eager to collect." Mikhail's jaw tightened. "They want to bind you, turn your power into a weapon they can control." He turned to face her, silver eyes blazing with desperate determination. "Elena, you have to run. Use your power to hide yourself again, become someone else, somewhere else. I'll hold them off as long as—" No. The word carried harmonics of divine authority that made the lighthouse's metal framework ring like a tuning fork. Elena stepped toward him, her human heart breaking even as her goddess mind calculated strategies. "Running is what I did before. Hiding is what kept me powerless when my daughter needed me most." She could see the moment he understood, not just her words, but the fundamental shift in who she had become. This wasn't the frightened physician who had found him bleeding on her doorstep, nor was it the fragmented divine being who had nearly torn reality apart during her awakening. This was Elena Vasquez, who remembered losing Sophia, and Elena the goddess, who remembered why mortal love mattered more than immortal safety. "They'll destroy you," Mikhail whispered. "They'll try." Elena moved to the lighthouse's control panel, her enhanced understanding revealing mechanisms her grandmother had hidden within the seemingly simple equipment. Not just a beacon for lost ships, but a focal point for protective wards that had kept this stretch of coast safe for decades. "But I'm not fighting alone, and I'm not fighting as the being they expect to find." Her fingers danced across hidden switches and concealed sigils carved into brass and steel. The lighthouse beam intensified, but now she could see its true purpose, not just light, but a network of energy that connected to similar beacons up and down the coast. Her grandmother had been part of something larger, a web of guardians who had spent their lives protecting the boundary between worlds. "Elena, what are you doing?" "Something that's never been tried before." She turned from the controls, silver fire beginning to dance around her fingers as she drew upon powers both divine and human. The Void Shepherds hunt by following divine energy signatures. They've learned to track and counter every expression of power they've encountered over millennia. The lighthouse beam swept across them, and Elena stepped into its path deliberately. The light didn't just illuminate her, it merged with her, amplifying and transforming as it passed through her hybrid nature. What emerged was something unprecedented, divine power filtered through mortal understanding, cosmic authority tempered by human compassion. "But they've never encountered a goddess who knows how to perform surgery," Elena continued, her voice growing stronger as the network of coastal beacons began to respond to her call. "They've never faced divine power wielded by someone who understands that healing sometimes requires cutting away what can't be saved." Through the lighthouse's enhanced reach, she could sense other guardians awakening, descendants of families like her grandmother's, keepers of old knowledge and older responsibilities, not powerful individually, but connected by bonds of purpose and sacrifice that had endured for generations. "I'm not running, and I'm not hiding," Elena said, extending her hand toward Mikhail. "I'm doing what I should have done 7 centuries ago. I'm choosing to fight for the world I love instead of fleeing from the power I feared." Mikhail stared at her outstretched hand for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity. Then his fingers closed around hers, vampire strength merging with divine purpose and mortal determination. "Together?" he asked. "Together," Elena confirmed, and felt the lighthouse network surge to full power as ancient protections merged with her unprecedented nature. The crimson dawn was brightening, bringing enemies that had never been successfully opposed. But it also revealed something else, a coastline dotted with answering lights, guardians emerging from hiding, and a goddess who had finally learned that true power came not from choosing between love and strength, but from refusing to accept that such a choice was necessary. The final test had begun. The Void Shepherds arrived like a wound torn in reality itself. Elena felt them before she saw them. 3 absences of light and warmth that moved across the crimson dawn with the inevitability of entropy. Where they passed, the ocean turned black, not with oil or shadow, but with the complete negation of existence. Even the lighthouse beams seemed to bend away from their approach, photons themselves recoiling from contact with beings who had consumed their own capacity for creation. 7 centuries, the first shepherd spoke without voice, its words manifesting as ice crystals in the air that shattered against Elena's enhanced awareness. 7 centuries we have tracked your scattered essence, goddess. Now you present yourself whole, ripe for harvesting. Elena stood at the lighthouse's peak, Mikhail beside her, the network of coastal guardians humming with combined purpose beneath her consciousness. She could feel her grandmother's spirit woven into the very stones, generations of lighthouse keepers who had died protecting this boundary. But more than that, she could sense the living guardians responding to her call, dozens of them emerging from hiding along hundreds of miles of coastline, each one carrying fragments of protective knowledge passed down through bloodlines that remembered when gods walked openly among mortals. "I'm not hiding anymore," Elena replied, her voice carrying across dimensions that shouldn't exist. "But I'm also not the same being you've hunted before." The second shepherd materialized closer, its form a writhing absence that hurt to perceive directly. Where it had once possessed a face, now only hunger remained, the insatiable need to devour divine essence that had driven it beyond the boundaries of coherent existence. "Power is power, little goddess. Mortality only makes it sweeter when consumed." "Then taste this," Elena said, and opened herself fully to the network of lights that stretched along the coast. What flowed through the lighthouse wasn't just her divine nature or her mortal experience, but the synthesis of both amplified by every guardian who had ever chosen to stand watch in the darkness. Her power as a goddess, yes, but filtered through Dr. Elena Vasquez's understanding of cellular biology and surgical precision. Divine authority wielded with the steady hands that had performed thousands of operations, that had held Sophia through countless treatments, that had learned healing requires both the power to cut and the wisdom to know when to stop. The lighthouse beam struck the first void shepherd like a scalpel made of starlight. Where previous gods had attacked with raw force, cosmic energies hurled like weapons, Elena performed surgery. Her enhanced perception mapped the shepherd's corrupted essence, identifying the points where its original divine nature had been twisted into self-consuming void. Instead of trying to destroy it outright, she began to excise the infection, cutting away the cancerous hunger that had transformed a god into a living absence. The shepherd's scream shattered windows along the coast, but Elena didn't falter. She had heard worse sounds in pediatric oncology wards. She had felt greater helplessness watching children die despite every effort to save them. This time, she had both the power and the knowledge to perform the surgery that mattered. Impossible, the third shepherd hissed, its attention snapping from Elena to the network of lights that fed her strength. The guardians were scattered, broken, their bloodlines diluted, but never forgotten, Mikhail said, his vampire strength adding itself to Elena's surgical precision. Around them, she could feel the Council of Shadows arriving from the north, drawn by the supernatural violence erupting along the coast. But instead of panic, Elena felt only the calm focus she'd learned in emergency rooms when every second counted, and there was no room for fear. The first shepherd was fighting back now, its void essence lashing out like infected tissue resisting removal. But Elena had performed operations on patients who were dying, whose bodies fought against the very procedures that could save them. She knew how to persist when the work was necessary, how to maintain precision when everything was trying to go wrong. You think mortality makes you stronger? The second shepherd surged forward, abandoning strategy for desperate assault. We will show you the futility of attachment, the weakness of caring. Elena caught its void essence in a construct of light that mapped exactly onto the surgical field generators she'd used to contain contaminated tissue. I think mortality gives me perspective you lost when you chose power over purpose, she replied, beginning the same careful excision she'd performed on its companion. I think being human taught me that strength without wisdom is just another form of cancer. The third shepherd hesitated, its ancient intelligence finally recognizing what it faced, not another god to consume, but something entirely unprecedented, a divine being who understood that true healing sometimes required destroying the disease to save the patient, even when the disease and patient had become indistinguishable. Your move, Elena said. Silver fire dancing around surgical instruments made of crystallized starlight. But choose quickly. I have other patients waiting. The final confrontation had truly begun. The third shepherd's hesitation lasted only a heartbeat before it made its choice, not to attack, but to retreat, dissolving into void stuff that scattered across dimensions like smoke before wind. Elena felt its essence fleeing toward safer hunting grounds, carrying word of what she had become to others of its kind. Let them know, she thought, maintaining her surgical focus on the second shepherd, even as part of her awareness tracked the Council of Shadows approaching from the north. Let them all understand that the rules have changed. The second void shepherd convulsed as her starlight scalpel found the core of its corruption. The moment 7 millennia ago when it had chosen to devour its own compassion in pursuit of absolute power. Elena could see the choice like a tumor wrapped around the being's essence, malignant and self-replicating, turning every attempt at healing into another vector for consumption. Please, something whispered from deep within the shepherd's void form, not the hungry intelligence that had spoken before, but an echo of what it had been. A fragment of the original god, trapped for eons within the cancer of its own making. Please, the pain. Elena's hands stilled for a moment. This was the choice she'd faced 1,000 times in pediatric oncology, when the disease had progressed beyond cure, when surgery would only prolong suffering. when mercy meant knowing when to stop fighting. But this time was different. This time she had the power to cut deeper. "I'm going to try something," she said to Mikhail, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "But if it doesn't work, if I get lost in there, you have to sever my connection to the network. Promise me." "Elena, what are you—" "Promise me." The lighthouse beam flared brighter as she prepared for the deepest surgery of her existence. "If I become like them, if saving this fragment means losing myself, you have to cut me off. The Guardians, the network, all of it. You have to let it burn." Mikhail's face went white, but his nod was firm. "I promise." Elena smiled, the same expression she'd worn before every impossible operation, every desperate attempt to save a life that statistics said was already lost. Then she plunged her consciousness directly into the Void Shepherd's corrupted core. The pain hit her like a physical blow. 7,000 years of self-inflicted anguish, divine essence consuming itself in endless loops of hunger and despair. But underneath the agony, she found what she was looking for, the original spark of creation that had made this being a god, buried but not destroyed, waiting for someone with the skill to separate it from the cancer that had grown around it. Elena began to cut with instruments made of crystallized memory, her daughter's laugh, Mikhail's tenderness, her grandmother's steady love, every moment of mortal beauty she had ever witnessed. Against the shepherd's endless hunger, she wielded the radical act of caring about something beyond herself. The void essence fought back with everything it had, trying to consume her compassion, to turn her healing power into another source of nourishment. Elena felt herself beginning to slip, her consciousness stretching dangerously thin as she performed surgery on concepts that predated physical existence. This was the cost, she realized with crystalline clarity. This was the sacrifice the universe demanded. To save what remained of this ancient god, she would have to give up her own safety, risk becoming the very thing she fought against. But unlike the shepherds, she had something they had lost, the knowledge of when enough was enough. With surgical precision born from both divine power and mortal wisdom, Elena made the final cut. The tumor of corruption, separated from the original spark like infected tissue, releasing its hold on healthy cells. The void essence shrieked as it died, truly died, not just dispersed, taking with it 7 millennia of accumulated hunger. What remained was barely a whisper of light, the fragment of the original god so diminished it could barely maintain coherent thought. But it was clean, free of the cancer that had consumed its siblings. "Thank you," the fragment breathed, its voice like wind through summer grass. "Thank you for remembering what we forgot." Then it too dissolved, not into void, but into peaceful dissolution, choosing rest over the endless struggle to exist. Elena felt its gratitude like warm rain as it passed beyond the boundaries of her perception, finally free to find whatever lay beyond the need for power. Elena withdrew her consciousness, returning to her own body to find Mikhail's hands on her shoulders, his face etched with worry. The lighthouse beam had dimmed to normal intensity, and she could feel the network of coastal guardians settling into watchful readiness rather than active defense. "How do you feel?" Mikhail asked. Elena took inventory. Divine power intact, mortal wisdom uncompromised, the synthesis of both stronger than before rather than weakened. But something fundamental had changed. She had proven it was possible to heal corruption that had existed since the dawn of creation, but doing so had revealed the true scope of what she had become. "Different," she said finally. "Like I've stepped across a line I can't uncross." She could sense the Council of Shadows approaching, could feel other ancient powers stirring as word spread of what had happened here. The war for the future of divine power was far from over, but now she knew the price of victory, and more importantly, she knew she was willing to pay it. The lighthouse fell silent, except for the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below. Elena remained motionless for several heartbeats, her consciousness slowly settling back into the boundaries of flesh and bone. The divine fire that had blazed around her during the surgery flickered and dimmed to a gentle silver glow beneath her skin, present but controlled, like a surgeon's steady hands after a successful operation. "The first one," Mikhail said quietly, his vampire senses tracking the void shepherd she had healed. "I can feel it, what's left of it, moving toward the deep ocean. It's peaceful." Elena nodded, though the word felt inadequate. What she had accomplished went beyond healing. She had performed resurrection on a concept that had been dead for millennia, separating the original divine spark from the cancer of its own corruption. The fragment that remained was barely more than a whisper of light, but it was clean, whole, free to choose dissolution over endless hunger. "And the third?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Gone, scattered across dimensions, carrying word of what you've become." Mikhail's hand found hers, fingers interlacing. "They'll adapt, Elena. The other shepherds, the ones you haven't faced, they'll learn from this encounter." "Good," Elena said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "Let them learn. Let them understand that there's another way." She turned from the lighthouse's observation deck to face him fully. "I'm not the same person who found you bleeding on my doorstep 6 weeks ago." The acknowledgement hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the woman who had lost her daughter and retreated to her grandmother's cottage, had been fundamentally transformed by divine awakening and the choice to synthesize rather than choose between her human and goddess natures. But the transformation felt less like death and rebirth than like finally becoming fully herself, the person she might have been if grief hadn't taught her to fear her own power. "Neither am I," Mikhail admitted. "I came here running from a past I couldn't change, from guilt that felt heavier than centuries, but watching you heal what everyone said was beyond salvation." He shook his head. "I remember now why I fell in love with Elena Thorne 300 years ago. Not because she was human and I was monster, but because she saw possibilities where others saw only problems." Elena felt the truth of it resonate through both memory and direct experience. The lighthouse beam swept across them again, but now its light revealed the network of guardians settling into new patterns along the coast. Her intervention had awakened something that had been dormant for generations, not just individuals with protective abilities, but an entire infrastructure of cooperation that spanned bloodlines and centuries. "The Council of Shadows is 2 miles out," she said, her enhanced awareness mapping their approach. "They're not coming to fight, but they're cautious." "They've never encountered a goddess who could heal void corruption," Mikhail observed. "Their entire understanding of divine power is based on the assumption that certain transformations are irreversible." Elena walked to the lighthouse's control panel, her fingers finding the hidden mechanisms her grandmother had maintained for decades. The network of coastal beacons pulsed in response to her touch, but the urgency of battle had been replaced by something steadier, the quiet vigilance of healers standing ready for whatever came next. "The war isn't over," she said, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. "The Void Shepherds were just one threat. There are others, older powers that have been waiting for divine authority to emerge again, entities that see gods as either tools or obstacles." She paused, recognizing the scope of what she had committed herself to. "I've declared myself an active force in a conflict that's been building since before human civilization." "Regrets?" Mikhail asked. Elena considered the question seriously. 3 years ago, she had been Dr. Elena Vasquez, emergency physician, mother to a daughter dying of leukemia, despite every medical intervention available. She had possessed skill without sufficient power, knowledge without the ability to perform the surgery that mattered most. Now she was something unprecedented, a goddess who remembered being human, divine authority wielded by hands that understood both healing and loss. "No," she said finally. "No regrets. For the first time since Sophia died, I have both the power and the wisdom to actually help when help is needed." She turned to meet his gaze. "But I need you to understand what staying means. This isn't going to be a quiet life by the sea. Every god, monster, and cosmic entity is going to want to know what I represent, and most of them are going to see me as either a threat to eliminate or a resource to control." Mikhail's smile held 7 centuries of patience and newfound hope. "Elena, I've spent lifetimes running from fights that mattered. If you'll have me, I'd like to try standing still and making a difference instead." The lighthouse beam completed another revolution, illuminating a coastline that had been quietly transformed. The immediate crisis had passed, but Elena could feel larger conflicts stirring in response to her emergence. For the first time since her daughter's death, she was ready. The lighthouse stood silent as dawn broke over the main coast, its beam finally extinguished after weeks of supernatural storm. Elena descended the spiral stairs slowly, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Through the windows she could see clear skies for the first time since the night she'd found Mikhail bleeding on her doorstep. A night that felt simultaneously like yesterday and like a lifetime ago. Her satellite phone, dormant for weeks, crackled to life on the kitchen table. 17 missed calls from Boston General, 43 text messages, 3 voicemails from her department head demanding to know if she was alive. The outside world, it seemed, was ready to reclaim her. Elena picked up the phone and dialed. Dr. Chen's office. "Margaret, it's Elena Vasquez." A sharp intake of breath. "Elena? Jesus. We've been trying to reach you for weeks. When the storm hit and all communication went down, Dr. Chen's been calling the Coast Guard daily. Are you all right?" Elena glanced at Mikhail, who was standing by the window watching the Council of Shadows boats approach through perfectly normal waves. "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. But I need to speak with Dr. Chen about my leave extension." "Extension? Elena, you've been gone for 6 weeks. The department covered your shifts, but..." "I know. I need more time. Is he available?" 20 minutes later, Elena found herself in the familiar position of explaining the inexplicable to her former life. Dr. Chen's voice carried the careful patience of someone talking to a colleague who might be having a breakdown. "Elena, I understand you've been through tremendous trauma with Sophia's passing. No one expects you to bounce back on any particular timeline, but disappearing during a natural disaster without communication..." "I'm resigning my position," Elena said quietly. "Effective immediately." The silence stretched for several heartbeats. "Elena, that's a significant decision. Perhaps we should discuss temporary leave options, counseling resources." "I've found a different way to help people," she said, watching through the window as the first council boat reached the shore. "Something that uses my skills, but broader scope." After hanging up, Elena sat motionless at her grandmother's kitchen table, feeling the weight of bridges burned. 15 years of medical training, 10 years of emergency medicine experience, a career built on healing people within the precise limitations of mortal medicine, all of it now relegated to her past. "Regrets?" Mikhail asked, echoing his question from the night before. "Sadness," Elena corrected. "That version of my life, it mattered." Dr. Elena Vasquez helped a lot of people, but she also had to watch children die because leukemia doesn't care about love or medical degrees. She stood, feeling divine power flow through her like a second circulatory system. "I'm not her anymore. I'm something that can actually do something about the diseases that killed Sophia." A knock on the cottage door interrupted her reflection. Elena opened it to find a woman she didn't recognize. Tall, elegant, with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that held centuries of careful observation. "Lady Vasquez," the woman said, offering a formal bow. "I am Councillor Thorne, speaking for the Council of Shadows. We come seeking audience." Elena blinked. "Thorne?" "Elena Thorne was my ancestor," the woman explained. "The mortal who loved a vampire 3 centuries ago, who died protecting the first lighthouse network from void incursion." Her gaze moved to Mikhail. "I believe you knew her." The next hour passed in careful negotiation around the kitchen table that had witnessed Elena's grandmother's quiet guardianship for decades. The council brought news from the wider supernatural world, reports of void shepherds retreating to distant dimensions, ancient powers stirring in response to Elena's emergence, and most significantly, other guardians awakening along coastlines across the globe. Your healing of the corrupted divine has created ripples, Councillor Thorne explained. Powers that have been dormant since the last divine war are choosing sides. Some see you as hope for a new paradigm. Others, she paused diplomatically, others prefer the predictable chaos of the status quo. What are you asking of me? Elena asked. Alliance. The Council has maintained supernatural law through careful balance for 8 centuries, but we lack the power to heal what you can heal. In exchange for our network, our intelligence, our resources. She gestured toward the window, where the lighthouse stood ready for whatever came next. We offer to support what you're becoming. Elena felt the offer resonate through the network of awakening guardians, sensed the potential for organized resistance against the forces that fed on divine corruption. But more than that, she felt the echo of her former life, the emergency room physician who had always worked best as part of a team. I accept, she said, but I lead any healing operations, no compromises on methodology. As the Council departed, Elena walked to the lighthouse one final time as Dr. Elena Vasquez. Tomorrow, she would begin learning what it meant to be something unprecedented, a goddess who remembered being human, a healer with divine authority, a woman who had found power and wisdom in the synthesis of all she had been and all she was becoming. The lighthouse beam swept across waters that held infinite possibility, the new beginning. 3 months later, Elena stood at the lighthouse's base, watching the sun rise over waters that no longer held the memory of supernatural storm. The beam above her head pulsed in rhythm with similar lights along coastlines across 6 continents, a network of guardians that had grown from her grandmother's quiet vigilance into something approaching divine infrastructure. Her phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Chen saw the news about the medical foundation. Proud of you, Elena. Sophia would be too. The Vasquez Foundation for Impossible Healing had made its public debut the week before, a research institute dedicated to exploring treatments for conditions that traditional medicine considered terminal. The press release mentioned breakthrough techniques for childhood leukemia, revolutionary approaches to genetic disorders, experimental therapies that showed impossible success rates. What it didn't mention was that the Foundation's director performed her most significant work with divine power channeled through hands that remembered every procedure she'd ever attempted as a mortal physician. The Seattle team reports success with the corrupted water elemental, Mikhail said, emerging from the cottage with coffee and the encrypted tablet that had replaced her grandmother's handwritten guardian logs. Clean separation, no void contamination remaining. That's 17 healings this month. Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, feeling the familiar satisfaction of surgical success multiplied across a global network. Each void shepherd they healed, each ancient power they cleansed of corruption, created ripples of stability that made the next intervention easier. The work felt like emergency medicine scaled to cosmic proportions, the same desperate race against entropy and suffering, but with tools adequate to the challenge. And the opposition? Regrouping. The entropy cults lost 3 major strongholds when you healed their patron entities, but they're adapting. Councillor Thorne believes they're seeking alliance with the old hungers, powers that predate divine authority entirely. Mikhail's expression grew serious. The war isn't ending, Elena. It's evolving. She nodded, unsurprised. In 3 months of active intervention, she had learned that cosmic healing carried the same fundamental challenge as emergency medicine. For every life saved, 10 more cases emerged that demanded attention. But the difference was that now she had both the power to help and the wisdom to choose her battles. The Children's Hospital in Mumbai wants another consultation, she said, scrolling through messages on her own tablet. 37 cases of spontaneous remission since our last visit. The oncology department thinks it's a statistical miracle. And the truth? A goddess who learned to practice medicine before she learned to wield divine authority. Elena smiled, remembering the faces of parents who had been told their children were terminal. Turns out bedside manner translates well to metaphysical surgery. The lighthouse beam completed another revolution, illuminating a coastline that had become the operational center for something unprecedented, a network of healers who treated supernatural corruption with the same systematic approach Elena had once applied to emergency trauma. The cottage had been expanded into a complex that housed researchers, guardians, and the growing archive of techniques for healing entities that predated human civilization. But the heart of it remained unchanged, her grandmother's kitchen, where Elena still drank morning coffee and planned operations that spanned dimensions. "Do you miss it?" Mikhail asked. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the straightforward life where mortality was the only enemy? Elena considered the question as she had every morning for 3 months. The woman who had found him bleeding on her doorstep had been brilliant, dedicated, and ultimately powerless against the forces that mattered most. She had possessed skill without adequate tools, knowledge without sufficient authority to implement solutions. "I miss the simplicity," she admitted, "but not the helplessness. Sophia died because leukemia doesn't respond to love or medical training. Now," she gestured toward the tablet displaying requests for intervention from 6 continents. "Now, when children are dying, I can actually do something about it." A new message appeared on the screen, a priority alert from the Council network. Ancient stirrings in the Pacific Trench, something vast and hungry beginning to wake from eons of dormancy. The kind of threat that would have been addressed with careful containment and acceptable casualties in the old paradigm. Elena drained her coffee and stood, feeling divine power flow through her like preparation for surgery. "How long until we can reach the coordinates?" 4 hours by Council aircraft. The deep-sea platform is already in position. Mikhail's smile held pride, and 7 centuries of patience finally rewarded. Ready to heal something that's been sleeping since before the continents took their current shape? Elena looked once more at the lighthouse beam, thinking of her grandmother's decades of quiet guardianship, of Sophia's courage in the face of terminal illness, of every patient she had lost to problems too large for mortal solutions. The synthesis of human wisdom and divine authority hadn't made the work easier. It had simply made it possible. "Always," she said, and meant it. "Let's go save the world." The lighthouse beam swept across waters that held infinite possibility, tended by successors who understood that some storms were worth weathering, some transformations worth embracing, and some kinds of healing worth any price demanded. Elena Vasquez had found her way home at last.